Immature, later known as IMX, formed in Los Angeles, California, 1991. Today's feature is a former 90s R&B group that had all the potential in the world in the 90s, but never seemed to get over the hump, going from promising artists to full-on superstars. At the time, kiddie groups were making its biggest wave in hip-hop and R&B as the child music star became the it thing for record labels to have under their umbrella. From Crisscross to Another Bad Creation, The Youngsters, Illegal, and more, but for the urban R&B side, Immature was tagged as the next big thing. They burst onto the scene in the early 90s in their first form with Marques Batman Houston as their lead singer, and Jerome Romeo Jones and Don Pint Santos playing backup. They released On Our Worst Behavior in 1992, accompanied by who other than Jermaine Dupri, who had a hand in many of the child prodigies over the years in hip-hop and R&B. Initially, they missed the mark on their first album, and their image entirely wasn't something the masses gravitated to, but by '94 on their second album, after some fine-tuning and re-imaging, they found success on their second album, Playtime is Over, that spawned 2 gold singles, Constantly, that peaked 16 on the US charts, and Never Lie, which became their biggest song to date, peaking at 5 on the US charts. The album itself went gold and made the Billboard Top 100 at 88. The potential for them to continue growing seemed promising, sparked by a third album released in '95 that sold moderately its first week, and although went gold, that wasn't until years later in 1997. That album didn't have the hits like their prior release, with no songs entering the top 20, but the album as a whole peaked higher than their previous, with many a bit confused as to why this group couldn't cross over, but always seemed they were just about to. They released 3 more albums since '95 in 2-year intervals, but none of the 3 topped the peak of their success on their earlier releases. In fact, their popularity decreased over time, and even a name change couldn't take them to the heights many expected. By the early 2000s, Immature had finally disbanded, with Marques Houston going on to have a moderately successful solo career. Romeo put out a rap album as Young Rome, and LDB continued to work on the producing side of music. In the end, many asked what happened to the group Immature from the 90s, and the story of their music journey is very simple. They had some hits and their fair share of misses, but nothing spectacular, and in the end, they lasted 10 years in an industry many that enter can't say the same. As far as them becoming superstars, here are 3 reasons that never happened. Let's talk about it. Salute to K Romance for this request. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth Music. Let's get it, man. Take a minute to like, subscribe, and comment on who I should do next. Immature, as a group, came together in the early 90s as 8-year-olds with manager and record producer Chris Stokes working on a few acts to bolster his resume at the time, like Brandy and Immature. The group started off with multiple members that didn't pan out, along with Marques Houston and Rome, who were the only ones to stick around. Later, Houston attempted to bring Kelton, aka LDB, in, who lived up the block from him but wasn't home to answer the call at the time. So Houston went down the street and recruited Don Pint Santos to form the 3-man boy group Immature. They released 1 album together in '92 under Virgin Records and starred in House Party 3 before Pint's parents removed him from the group to focus on his academics. LDB was the group's drummer at the time when Houston suggested they move him up to replace Pint, and the group took off as the trio we grew to know. Their next 2 albums both went gold, along with 3 gold singles during the 90s. The group was a moderate success, but here's why they weren't bigger names in R&B. Stunt number 1, weren't moving the needle. If I had to say the most important, not necessarily the first issue with the group Immature, I'd have to say their output wasn't bringing back the returns that could make them bigger artists. Yes, they had the formula popular at the time, talented kids singing about adult content they shouldn't know anything about, but for whatever reason, it didn't amount to platinum singles and albums. Their first album by industry standards was a flop, and their image quickly grew old and in desperate need for an upgrade. Moving on from making kiddie bop content, the kids their age weren't old enough to go out and purchase themselves, and no streaming button they could push on their new smartphone. Immature had to evolve their content and image to suit an older audience. They began focusing on songs dedicated to the female love of their eyes and had success with Never Lie and Constantly, both going gold and becoming top 20 Billboard singles and some would say R&B classics. But those would remain throughout their career as their only top 20 hits of their catalog. Their other gold single, Stay the Night, came 5 years later. In entertainment, the goal is obviously to entertain and capture as many eyes and ears as possible, but it's still a business side to it, and moving the needle as far as bringing back a substantial return on the investment into the group and album to that point, flip-flop with entertainment as what's most important. Immature were competing with the golden era of not just R&B, but hip-hop artists as well, many who went on to be legends in the game. Credit them for even being able to make a name for themselves in the ultra-competitive 90s, but the return just wasn't enough. It wasn't terrible, as they did go gold on back-to-back albums in 94 and 95, even if it took a few years to do so. They even attempted to change with the new millennium, going from Immature to IMX, but neither of the two albums released under that name cracked the top 100, leading to them disbanding in 2002. Stunt number 2, Times Changed. In the early 2000s, the kiddie hip-hop act was beginning to be a thing of the past. Also around that time, hip-hop in general had evolved into being more focused on material possessions, achievements, and artists wanting to build their own legacy. R&B changed altogether and was now being dominated by solo artists like Usher, Mario, Beyonce, Alicia Keys, and many more. Not to mention Chris Stokes' new rendition of Immature, B2K, bursting onto the scene as the new and improved 2000s version. Same formula with Omarion as the lead, having certified star quality, a better vocalist, and even his dance moves were an upgrade from Marques Houston. Playing the background were Lil Fizz, J-Boog, and Raz B, controversial but just enough personality to stand out in the shiny new era, making Immature, then IMX, literally old news. In those times, the group really didn't have much of a choice but to pursue solo careers, especially Marques Houston, who always carried the group as the lead voice and personality, with his work in television becoming just as successful as the group's career. They would reunite in 2014 for an album called Forever, but it didn't last, as by then, their sound and long past era couldn't recreate the spark. Stunt number 3, not versatile enough. A huge reason I think the formula often used in R&B groups at the time only worked for a short time was because most groups stuck to the one lead singer doing pretty much everything routine, and eventually that gets old. If the lead singer isn't a standout personality himself to continue creating enough controversy or talk that brings the group attention. Marques Houston was a star, but he didn't have superstar qualities about himself. His nasal falsetto vocals was cute.
These dirty paws, man. I want to not be careful.
But he didn't evolve over time into a great vocalist. He still kinda had the same nasally sound, just older. He wasn't a dancer that could carry portions of his act like Usher, Chris Brown, or Omarion. He didn't play an instrument, and he wasn't constantly in the news for this or that reason. The group would only go as far as his star took them, and he did all he could. The other two were basically backup singers that didn't display other talents, although Rome was tagged as a rapper, but
Come on, son. Get the fuck out of here with that.
IMX's star could only grow so big because for whatever reason they weren't equipped to get any bigger. All in all, Immature, or IMX, still made a few classic R&B tracks and does have a place in urban music. They lasted much longer than most groups, even B2K, who charted higher, but lasted just a few years before they too disbanded. Memorable group that were stars in their time, certainly not disappointing, but for these reasons, they didn't become bigger artists. Salute, much respect. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth Music, and I'm out.